around 35% of shells didn't explode at all, which is why you have the harvest of steel still in French farms, where people are ploughing up duds that simply didn't go off. So improved techniques of production, improve the quality of the material being produced and the numbers, and of course it had another effect, that many of the people working in those munitions factories were not men at all, they were women. And those women in Britain were allowing men to come and serve on the Western Front, because obviously you have a finite supply of men in the British Isles, and those men are now being, rather than working in the factories, are actually being sent out to the Western Front. One of the reasons why you have so many middle-aged soldiers fighting in the last 18 months of the war.
On the 16th of April 1917, the French attacked. French artillery fired over 9 million shells in the pre-assault barrage. The gently sloping plains under the ridge were soon turned into a hellish moonscape of shell holes by the relentless artillery barrage. Assaulting across the dense lines of barbed wire, the French troops were systematically slaughtered by German machine gunners emerging from their deep dugouts, or by German heavy artillery. The initial decisive breakthrough on the Aisne was a complete failure. By the 25th of April, the French had suffered over 96,000 casualties. The objective was now reduced to capturing the Chemin des Dames. For another 2 weeks, the assaults would continue day and night. Incredibly, a battalion of Senegalese colonial troops made it onto and over the Chemin des Dames ridge, but they had simply fallen into a German ambush. Surrounded and attacked from 4 sides, they were wiped out.
Part of the Chemin des Dames was underground quarries, used well before the war, that the Germans took when they took the Chemin des Dames. They installed themselves. It was a great shelter from French artillery fire. So they installed themselves there, had munitions depots, they had hospitals in there, they had a canteen in there. It was really a military headquarters on this Chemin des Dames, well out of sight of the Allies and the French, who couldn't even see the German positions, which then led to the miscalculations of the French, thinking they could just easily take it. So it was this huge underground fortification that the Germans then built out. They added tunnels to it, they added exits to it, they built these quarries into, they militarized the quarries. So during a period of time in 1917, you have what is called la cohabitation, the cohabitation of both sides. You have Germans in those underground tunnels, and you have French in those underground tunnels, fighting each other underground, in the dark, around the corners. Of course, gas was also used in the war, and was also used on the Chemin des Dames. So at one point, afraid of gas attacks in these caverns, the Germans started building walls that would protect them from the gas attacks. Gas being heavier than air, it sank neatly into these caves and killed everyone in the caves.
Fighting at the Chemin des Dames continued until mid-May. By then, not only had Naval's offensive failed, but the French army's morale had reached the breaking point. Living in damp caves and trenches, fighting rats and lice, only to face certain death in senseless daily attacks and counterattacks, the French army had simply had enough. French High Command now not only had to deal with a broken strategy, but with widespread disobedience, desertion and mutiny. The situation had become critical. France was on the verge of collapse.
Well, it's important to realize that the Chemin des Dames is the defining terrain characteristic of the Champagne region. It's a very long ridge that runs east to west and is strategic ground. Now, when the Germans fell back in 1914 to the Chemin des Dames, they reinforced it, so it became virtually impregnable. The French knew that they had their work cut out for them, and so in Nivelle's 1917 offensive, they put an artillery piece every 20 meters along a 40-kilometer front. During the days preceding the attack, they poured more than 50 million artillery shells into the German defenses. Last year, French bomb disposal experts removed 62 tons of unexploded ordnance from the area around the Chemin des Dames, and they estimate that at this rate, it'll take them 700 years to clear it all. And French archaeologists estimate that the bombardment was equal to 100 million years of natural erosion.
Nivelle was sacked. General Pétain, the hero of Verdun, was appointed to take his place. Pétain, an infantryman himself and the consummate soldier's soldier, immediately took measures to improve pay, leave and living conditions. Somehow, Pétain restored order. Rejecting large offensives, he focused on limited objectives. His strategy was simple: I will await the Americans and the tanks. In the beginning of 1918, the German High Command was faced with two transformational events. The first was the revolution in Russia and the total collapse of the Russian military at the end of 1917. This permitted the redeployment of large numbers of forces from the eastern to the western front. The second, more ominous for the Germans, was the entry of the Americans into the war in April 1917. General Pershing paraded the first American troops down the Champs-Élysées on American Independence Day 1917. By March 1918, there were 318,000 troops in France. It was the vanguard of more than 1.3 million to be deployed by August.
Well, Ludendorff was faced with a critical decision in the spring of 1918. The capitulation of the Russians, on one hand, presented an enormous opportunity because he was able to redeploy troops from the Eastern Front to the Western Front. But the entrance of the Americans into the war, and in 1918 their arrival in significant numbers, meant that his window of opportunity was very quickly closing. Hence, he knew that he had to, in a war that's defined by the Germans by German risk-taking, Ludendorff knew that he clearly had to throw the dice one final time in a desperate attempt to end the war in 1918 before the Americans arrived in any significant numbers. That was the theme of the offensive of 1918.
Ludendorff knew that he had a 6-month window of opportunity before enough American troops arrived in France in significant enough numbers to tip the strategic balance. Time was running out for Germany. Ludendorff decided to launch a last campaign to deliver the decisive blow, the Kaiserschlacht or Spring Offensive. The first offensives brought initial success. Operation Michael, launched on the 21st of March 1918, focused on British forces near Amiens, near the Somme Valley. German forces achieved an unprecedented advance of 60 kilometers along the Somme. But unused to offensive operations and without tanks, the German offensive stalled and losses were heavy, and Ludendorff reluctantly suspended Operation Michael. A second offensive in Flanders, codenamed Georgette, would threaten the Channel ports defended by the British Expeditionary Force. The British were badly battered by German artillery and resistance began to collapse. Haig ordered the British positions to be held to the last man. There must be no withdrawal. The British lines held. Ludendorff soon called off the offensive. In 3 weeks, the Germans had lost more than 303,000 killed or wounded at Amiens and another 120,000 in Flanders. Frustrated in the north, Ludendorff turned his attention to the French defences at the Chemin des Dames in a final throw of the dice. The Germans launched their third offensive, codenamed Blücher, on the 27th of May. The Germans threw 40 divisions and 6,000 pieces of artillery against the French and British. They quickly overwhelmed the exhausted soldiers, opening the way to the Marne River and Paris just beyond. Within 5 days, the Germans had advanced to a line between Soissons and Château-Thierry, only 56 miles from the French capital.